Buenos días a todos y todas. Empezamos este seminario, el curso, ¿en qué estamos? 24, 25. Hoy nos visita Dario Mortini. Dario es parte de un proyecto en el que todos estamos involucrados, es el proyecto Evidence de la María Maeztu del BIAP. Y en ese contexto es uno de los investigadores postdoctorales que han sido contratados por el BIAP. Él hizo ya el máster de filosofía analítica en el grupo Logos y ha pasado por universidades distintas de Europa, la University of Southern Denmark, la University of Tilburg y la Universidad de Colonia en Alemania, y ahora de vuelta en Barcelona. Dedica su investigación fundamentalmente a la naturaleza y el papel de la prueba, desde el punto de vista epistemológico, que es su área de estudio, y nos va a presentar hoy un trabajo en elaboración, Asserting Guilt, How to Do Things with Veredicts of Guilt. Hemos acordado un seminario bilingüe en el que hará la presentación en inglés y después podremos tener también el debate en castellano si quieren intervenir en esa lengua. Así que estamos muy felices de tenerte aquí con nosotros, Dario, que espero que sea la primera de unas cuantas veces que nos visites durante al menos tu estancia en BIAP y nada, tu tiempo.
Thanks. First off, I'm very happy to be here. I feel very privileged to be talking about questions at the intersection of epistemology and evidence law with you. This is an excellent research group, and I'm very excited to hear what you think. I have done a little bit of work on the epistemology of legal proof during my doctorate. Then I somehow stopped working on that, like other projects just got in the way. But when I was preparing this talk, when I was writing up the slides, I was just pleasantly reminded that this is such an exciting topic, so I'm very, very happy to be able to talk about it with you today. I always feel a little bit hesitant and nervous to be talking about the epistemology of the law. I think it has to be done very carefully. I think it has to be done sort of very slowly. If today I somehow lose track of certain things that are important in the law, please help me out, because that's exactly the point of being here with you today. So, as a warm-up, I just want to invite you to read with me this quote from Judith Thompson's paper, Liability and Individualized Evidence. So, at the end of the paper, this is what Judith Thompson writes. So she says, the jurors do not say, we know that the defendant is guilty at the close of the trial. They say only, the defendant is guilty. But in saying that, they do something of great significance. It is not strong enough to say that they declare the defendant guilty. If you and I have been watching the trial, I may say to you in the courtroom, the defendant is guilty. I have declared the defendant guilty, but I have not done because I'm not so situated to be able to do what the jurors do when they say these words at the close of the trial. And then she adds, the institution in which they are participating is so structured that their saying these words is then their imposing liability on the defendant. If they say these words at the time, appropriate orders will act on the supposition that he is guilty. So I think this is a very intriguing, inspiring passage. Sometimes you hear people saying that philosophy is a footnote to Plato's dialogues. I think legal epistemology is a long, convoluted footnote to this paper that Thompson wrote in '86. There are a bunch of things that I think are interesting here. So first, she's kind of drawing the attention to the fact that when a verdict of guilt is in place, people are saying something. Somehow there is a connection between what people say and the verdict of guilt. And then she says that, well, this is not just something that you can say as a sort of spectator of the trial. That's something that you can say only if certain things are in place. Certain procedures, certain laws, whatever. We can sort of talk about this later on. But the very important thing that she says, I think, it's at the end of this course. So she says, they're saying these words is then they're imposing liability. So liability, guilt, it's imposed by saying these words. And I think that's an interesting thought, and that's the kind of thought that I want to unpack today. So again, just to sort of bring you on the same page as I am, so I think there is some sort of insight here, so there is some kind of crucial connection between speech acts and legal verdicts. So the claim that the defendant liable, the claim that the defendant guilty, is something that the fact finders do with words. And there are two things that I would like to do with you today. So first, I would like to sort of make good on this kind of insight. So I want to sort of explore the communicative dimension of verdicts of guilt. And then I want to sort of try to approach some questions in legal epistemology. So some questions in the epistemology of standards of proof, some questions on the epistemology of legal proof from the perspective of speech act theory. So from the perspective of someone who takes seriously the idea that imposing liability, declaring guilt is something that we essentially do with words. So I hope this will not disappoint to you, but so what I want to do today is a very sort of exploratory project. So I will not really advocate for a specific conclusion. So at some point I will talk about some norms, norms of assertion when it comes to legal verdicts. I will just lay out some options, but I will not defend one of these norms. But there is an ambition that I have today, which is like, okay, at the very least I would like to try to convince you that this idea that speech acts are important for standards of proof is like a good way to theorize about standards of proof in epistemology and philosophy of language. Because I don't see this done very clearly at the moment. So how am I going to proceed? So I would like to introduce a distinction that I think is very important when we talk about standards of proof, or at least when epistemologists talk about standards of proof. And then I want to try to give a speech act analysis of verdicts of guilt. So just to spoil a little bit what's coming ahead, so you will see that declaring someone guilty is to perform a certain type of assertion. And I will try to say something about what is the norm of this kind of assertion. Again, I will not really land on a specific norm, but I will give you some options. And then I will try to sort of generalize this approach, and I would like to sort of see whether we can really think of standards of proof as kind of performative speech acts. And before concluding, I will just give you a little summary so that you have very clear in front of your eyes what you might want to ask me in the Q&A. Okay, so let's introduce this distinction that I think it's important when it comes to think about standards of proof. Okay, so to my untrained and sort of rough epistemologist eyes, someone asked me, okay, what are standards of proof? I would start with sort of zeroing on their function. I'm sure you have a way more sophisticated understanding of the standards, but if I had to reduce them to something, I would say, okay, we need them for a certain thing. So we need them to determine whether this body of evidence adduced provides strong enough support for some legal verdict. What are the standards? So you have this balance of probability standards, the preponderance of evidence standards, that's a civil standard. And then you have this sort of middle standard that is used, I think, both in civil and criminal law, and it's kind of more demanding. So you have the clear and compelling evidence standard, then you have the infamous beyond reasonable doubt standard. Epistemologists love this standard for reasons reasons that you might guess, but these are the kind of standards of proof that people are mentioning in this legal epistemology literature. I would say that most people focus on the criminal standard, but sometimes they also say something about the other two. Again, I'm sure you have a very sort of sophisticated understanding of the standards, much deeper than the one that I have, but something that I think is very important when we're thinking about the speech acts and the sort of epistemology of the standards is that they become increasingly more demanding. So you start out with a weakish standard, the preponderance of evidence, then you move to a sort of more demanding standard, the clear and compelling evidence, the clear and convincing evidence, and then you land to the sort of most demanding standard. And this demandingness is an important datum that I think epistemologists want to try to capture. And I will try to capture it as well. Okay, so what have my peers said about the standards? So there's been a sort of flurry of work, I think, in the past 10 years or so on the epistemology standards of proof. And one view that people have put forth link very strongly, or more or less strongly, the standards of proof with knowledge. The last defender of this view, the most recent defender of this view is Sarah Moss. She has this paper published in 2022, Oxford Studies in Epistemology. She has a very straightforward knowledge account of the standards. So she says knowledge is necessary and sufficient for legal proof. Some people have connected knowledge and the standards of proof, but they did that in a more indirect way, I think. So Georgie Gardiner, she moves from a condition on knowledge to a condition on the standards of proof. So there is this somewhat influential theory of knowledge, it's called the relevant alternatives theory of knowledge. Bretsky defended it. And then Georgie Gardiner says, okay, well, this requirement of eliminating relevant alternatives is actually useful to think about legal proof. So, okay, let's look at how knowledge works, and then let's move from this conditional knowledge to another condition on standards of proof. I don't think she would be very happy to be put in this slide because she's aware that you're kind of inheriting some difficulties if you move from relevant alternatives to legal proof, but again, I think that there is a sense in which she's in this group of people that think of legal proof along the lines of whatever is necessary for knowledge. So I told you I'm a huge fan of this paper by Thompson. Juan Comesaña talked about this. I don't know if you remember people that were here in December. After his talk, I was a little bit unsure that my interpretation of Thompson is correct, but I always thought that Judith Thompson is really moving from this kind of causal condition of knowledge to this causal condition on the kind of evidence that you needed to meet the standard. Causal theories of knowledge are no longer fashionable, but again, you can see what is happening here. So these people always think of knowledge and then they sort of focus on a feature of knowledge that they think it's useful for legal proof, for the evidence they need to meet the standards, or for one or more standards of proof. That's not the only way you can go. In fact, there's a fairly recent approach that doesn't really focus on knowledge, but it focuses on a different kind of state, which is like this epistemic justification. So this is a bit of a technical term, but you can think of epistemic justification as a sort of positive status that your belief has. So we have very sophisticated theories of epistemic justification, and some people have decided to exploit these theories to elucidate the standards. So Martin Smith, he has, to my mind, the most sophisticated account of the standards. He rejects very clearly the idea that standards of proof are a matter of knowledge, but he uses his very complicated account of epistemic justification to elucidate all the standards. So it was the normic standard of proof. He talked about it for reasonable doubt, and also talked about it for less And then you have I guess the probabilists, that you always have to mention the probabilists, they exist, they create troubles, so they have to be mentioned, I guess. And you also have like a big tradition of people that they move from this kind of theory of rational belief. Maybe they are Bayesians, maybe they are sort of a different type of Bayesians, but what they want to do is really to sort of give an account of the standards in terms of this sort of account of Bayesian rationality or probabilistic rationality. And I think these people, what they have in mind is that, well, there is a sort of status of rationality that you believe can have, and with that status you can elucidate the standard. What about something that is, I guess, relevant for the kind of project that I want to pursue today? So what about the connection between norms of assertion and standards of proof? There's not that much on this, actually. So the most explicit way to think of standards in terms of norms of assertion, as far as I can tell, is due to Jennifer Lackey. So Jennifer Lackey, she's a big epistemologist. She has a very, very, very influential norm of assertion. And she wrote a paper in 2023. There is this special issue of philosophical issues on legal epistemology. She has this paper in that issue on the epistemology of evidence law, and she says, okay, I have a norm of assertion. I can use this norm of assertion to elucidate convictions. And what she means is really like imposing liability or like finding someone guilty. So it's not clear whether this is a norm of action, it's not clear whether this is a norm of assertion, but at least you can see that she's moving from her norm of assertion. Okay, so when I was working on this in my PhD, I started to worry that people were talking about very different things when they were putting forward these views. I never voiced these concerns, but I'm going to voice them today with you today because I think it's kind of helpful to ask these questions. So when I sort of read these papers written by epistemologists, it's not really clear to me what is the exact normative target of these claims. In fact, I can see that these people are sort of putting forth norms. They're talking about certain statuses, knowledge, justification, but it's never very clear to me what is the sort of subject matter that they're interested in. So some people talk about legal proof, that's very general. Some other people talk about conviction. Some people mention assertion. Some people, they're interested in belief. So I think that these are very different things. This is not to say that epistemologists are confused. I mean, maybe they are, but that's not what I want to suggest. But I think it would be good, at least, to introduce some distinctions, to think about what aspects of the standards are actually being picked out, what aspects of the standard we're talking about when we make this claim. So, one way to introduce this distinction is to distinguish between two aspects of the standards of proof. So you might think of standards of proof as being sort of broken down into two components. So you might have some upstream normativity, and this would be whatever normative status that has to be met before legal proof. And then you can also think of standards as sort of generating some normative demands after the standards are met. So I'm borrowing this distinction. This distinction is pretty discussed in the literature on assertion. So if you're Williamson and you defend a constitutive norm of assertion, you're going to give a norm about what it takes to assert. So you're doing something similar to what has been done here. So you're asking, okay, what does it take to assert? But if you are someone like Brandon or McFarlane, you're interested in normativity of assertion, but what you're going to do is to think about assertion in terms of the kind of commitments that you take on after you assert. And I think that something similar is happening with the standards. So this kind of upstream normativity question is fundamentally a doxastic question. So it's a question about belief, I think. Martin Smith says that there is a normic standard of proof. Well, I think that what he means is that to form a belief of guilt, you need a specific type of evidential support. That's what he calls normic support. But these are evidential requirements on the belief of the fact finders. And here we're talking about a distinctively epistemic type of normativity. So we're talking about the privacy of the fact finder's mind and what kind of thing their beliefs have to be to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Maybe it's knowledge, maybe it's less than knowledge, maybe it's connected to a specific type of evidence, it has to be individualized, if Thompson is right. But again, this is a sort of narrower question than the kind of claims that I showed you before. In fact, I think that some of those claims that I showed you before, they land more in this type of question. So I'm going to call it the communicative question, and this is a different type of question that, of course, it's very important for the standards, but it's not really explicitly discussed. So this is a question about what it takes to communicate a verdict of guilt, and this is in a way a more sort of external perspective, and this is a sort of normative requirement on communication. Is it still epistemic normativity? Yes, it is. But it is about the epistemic normativity of a speech act, whatever speech act we're performing when we are declaring someone guilty. And it's good to distinguish these two because you might think that they just make distinct demands. So in a way, I don't see any incoherence in thinking that when it comes to this part, what you need is maybe a weaker state. Maybe you need a justified belief of guilt. Maybe you need a sort of probabilistically informed belief. But then when we move to this side, you might need more. Maybe you need knowledge. Maybe you need certainty. And you need more because one thing is to form a belief in your mind, and another thing is to communicate that belief, especially when the stakes are so high as in a criminal trial, sorry. So again, I think there's a difference here. You have this sort of doxastic question that is about the inner. You have this communicative question that is about the outer. And I think that in general, we have different normative requirements on this kind of inner information and outer communication. And if this is correct, then we can think of what is the distinctive normative requirement on the speech act of a verdict, on what it means to share a verdict. And I think that this distinction just gives us a good entry point on why it would be worth to have a speech act analysis of verdicts of guilt. Because now, if we go back to the picture that I showed you before, we're more on this side. So now I want to explore what it means to have this sort of speech act theoretic approach to verdicts. And again, this is a question mostly about communication. It's not necessarily a question only about belief. So let me say something about speech act theory. So maybe you're already familiar with this stuff, but hopefully it will not be boring, and maybe it will be useful because this is an explicit attempt to connect speech act theory with legal issues. I think people have done it probably better than I'm going to do it, but if you're already familiar with these notions, I hope you will not be bored because it's still interesting, I think, to explore them in this kind of context. So here's two examples that people always mention when it comes to speech acts. So these examples are due to John Austin. So suppose that we're walking in a harbor, and then I tell you that this ship is called Queen Elizabeth. Now, Austin noted that when I do this, I'm reporting a fact. So he called this speech a constitutive. So you're basically sort of affirming some fact about the way things are. And then he contrasted the first example with the second example. So suppose that we have our nice bottle of champagne, we're in a position to do it, we have the authority to do it, and then we smash the bottle and we say, I hereby name this ship Queen Elizabeth. That's a different type of thing that we just did. And interestingly, we did it just by saying a certain sentence. And he called this performative. He noted that constitutives can be true or false, but performatives aren't really true or false, but they can be sometimes infelicitous if, for instance, I don't have the authority to name a ship. Of course, the law has similar cases. So, in fact, I think that the quote that I gave you from Thompson was picking up on something like this. So, if I'm watching the trial and maybe I know on the basis of maybe unadmissible evidence that the defendant is guilty, I can assert that the defendant is guilty, but I will not have declared them guilty, as Thompson said. Because declaring someone guilty is to perform a specific type of thing for which we need a specific type of authority. So that's a performative. And of course, these are legally significant speeches. So the interesting thing is that the fact finder with a relevant authority, if they follow the right procedure, is doing more than just reporting a fact. When they utter the verdict, they're making it a fact that the defendant is guilty. So we have this distinction in place, we can actually be even more precise. So Austin has this threefold distinction that you can apply to every speech act. It kind of expands on the distinction between constative and performatives, but if you got that distinction, it's going to be relatively easy. So take any speech act, you can break it down into three components. So you can sort of look at the locutionary act, which is just a simple act of saying something. So this is me uttering a sentence by using certain words. I can say the bank closes at 5. But then you can do something more than that. So you can also perform an illocutionary act. And like in a slogan, in saying something, the speaker does something. So, of course, I can utter a string of words, but with those words, there are many things I can do. I can assert the bank closes at 5. I can ask, does the bank close at 5? And I can also order that the bank should be closed at 5. Close the bank at 5. And then, when we say certain things, we have a kind of an effect on the people around us. And this is the perlocutionary act, also called perlocutionary effect. So by saying something, the speaker does something. So in virtue of saying what they did, they can achieve something new. So for instance, I can assert that the bank closes at 5, and if you think I'm a trustworthy person, I may persuade you that the bank will close at 5. If you need to deposit a check, I don't know if it's still possible in 2025, but suppose that it is. If you need to deposit a check and I tell you that the bank closes at 5, I may warn you that you should go to the bank and deposit your check. So there are many things that we can achieve by saying something. And that is going to depend on many factors, but that's the kind of effect of certain assertions. And of course, again, if you're interested in this communicative question, one interesting thing that you can ask is how do these three components map onto verdicts, for instance, verdicts of guilt. So again, the locutionary aspect of a verdict of guilt is relatively straightforward, perhaps even boring in a sense. So what we have to do here is basically fix the meaning, the sense, and the reference of a verdict of guilt. So this is basically a question about what is being said, and it's pretty straightforward. So, for instance, in the case of a criminal verdict, it is that the locutionary aspect of a verdict is something like this: we find the defendant guilty. And then there's a little bit of discussion on what is exactly the proposition that is being expressed here, and apparently there are three interpretations. So you can take this to be sort of a proposition about the material facts. You can take this to be a proposition about proof. So for instance, this means that it is going to be proven, or it is proven according to the law, for instance, that the defendant committed a crime. And if you have some sympathy for this kind of probabilistic account, you might take this to be a proposition about probability. So it is sufficiently probable the defendant committed the crime that they're accused of. I think there's a fourth one. So if you are sympathetic to this kind of explanationist accounts, you might think that this is actually a proposition about plausibility, if you like this. But again, this is not especially interesting to me, but it's interesting at least to see that you can easily get a sense of the kind of proposition expressed by a verdict of guilt. I think these interpretations are all plausible. There might be more, but the more interesting bit for me is the illocutionary aspect. So here we're talking about what kind of assertion we're performing. And the tricky thing is that find is not obviously a candidate for certain clear assertions. So what kind of speech act is performed in these cases? I mean, you should look at the verb. So we find the defendant guilty. Now, Austin and Searle were aware of this. So if you look at this kind of early speech act theory, they love legal examples. And they, both Austin and Searle, they kind of noticed that find is in a way a hint. So Austin calls it an explicit performative verb. Searle calls it an illocutionary force indicator. These are sort of complicated terms. So what they mean is that these are expressions that tell you and clarify the exact force of the speech act. So here's two examples just to give you an idea. If I say, I promise you that I will come to the evidence week, I am telling you that I'm promising you that. So I'm revealing the kind of speech act that I'm performing. If I say, I warn you that summers in Girona are usually hot, once again, I am using a verb that tells you very clearly what is the force of the speech act. It's a warning. So what kind of thing is being performed with find? That's trickier because you cannot just move from find into a clear speech act. But I think that it's plausible that a finding of guilt, or people say we declare, we find the defendant guilty, it's kind of a strengthened assertion. So it's not any assertion, it's not like saying, oh, that ship is called the Queen Elizabeth. It's an assertion that also does something more. And I will come back to this in a couple of slides. But so far, just the important thing is that this is an assertion, but it's not any kind of assertion. It seems to be stronger than standard assertions. What about the perlocutionary aspect? Well, this might be interesting for some of you maybe. So of course, there is a difference between the intended and the actual effect of a speech act. So for instance, if I tell you that I had pizza in that restaurant and I do not like it, I may intend to discourage you from eating there, but whether I actually discourage you basically depends on you. It depends on whether you think that I have good tasting food, among other things. You can ask a similar question about verdict of guilt. So what is the kind of effect on the audience, maybe also on society at large, that a verdict of guilt purports to have, intends to have? Here, what I think would be possible to do is to plug your favorite theory of punishment. So I haven't looked at this literature in a while, but I remember that Duff has this very interesting theory of punishment. So he thinks that punishment is a manner of communicating disapproval of the criminal act to sort of encourage repentance and reform so that the person who commits the crime can be reintroduced into society. Very, very sort of subtle theory. But I think that this kind of theory really pairs well with this kind of question. So what is the intended effect of a verdict of guilt, among other things? Well, it's to communicate disapproval to encourage repentance and reform. You might be a retributivist, you might defend your own theory of punishment, and you can apply it here, but I think that it's interesting at least to note that this kind of theory goes very well with the perlocutionary effect of the verdict. So, can we be more precise? So, can we actually give a precise answer to the question on the illocutionary force and the kind of assertion that is being made when a verdict of guilt is in place? So, this is the kind of hypothesis that you can glean from what people have written about it. So, the most plausible hypothesis here is a kind of hybridity hypothesis. So the idea is that it would be mistaken to think that there is only one thing, one speech act performed in a verdict. It's actually double. So it's multidimensional, if you want. So there are two speech acts performed at once. So one is an assertion, and one is a declaration, basically. And again, this is something you can glean from these kind of discussions that are very, very old on speech act theory. So you have an assertive dimension of guilt. So a verdict of guilt has to assert a proposition about a set of facts. Basically, the defendant did certain things that constitute a crime. But it's not just that, because that's something that we can all do. What we cannot do, though, is to change the world in virtue of what we say. That's something that only the jury can do. So a verdict of guilt is also a declaration. So it creates a new legal fact, it changes things, sometimes very substantially. So it declares also the defendant is guilty. And I really want to hammer this point home. So again, we can think about this together. So a verdict of guilt cannot be a pure assertion. Again, maybe you and I are watching a trial, you assert the defendant is guilty. That's not going to be a verdict. I can assert truly and sincerely that the defendant is guilty, but that's not going to be a verdict. We need more. We need, I would say, the relevant legal facts. We need rules. We need authority. We need all the things that have to be in place in a trial. So Thompson talks about the institution is so structured, so I think that's what she is getting at. And of course, this kind of verdict of guilt, it's not a pure declaration either, because declarations are fairly easy to achieve. So suppose that you're the queen of a state, you can just successfully declare war by declaring that there is a war. The marriage example is also kind of telling here, so a priest can marry two people just by simply declaring they're married. But that's not what a fact finder, a judge, a jury can do. They cannot just say, we declare the defendant to be guilty. They need to back up this declaration with a previous assertion. And that's the most sort of, the more truth-related aspect of a verdict of guilt. So again, what are verdicts of guilt? They are a motley crew of things. They're like this kind of mashup of assertions and declarations. So let me give you like a quick recap so that you know what is happening before I can say something about norms. So locutionary act, that's just what has been said. I don't think it's very interesting, but maybe you're interested in this. And this is just a proposition about the defendant guilt that you can interpret in two ways. This is what I'm interested in. So what is the force of the verdict? It's a strengthened multidimensional assertion. So it's an assertion and a declaration. Here, I mean, we can talk about is in the Q&A maybe. So the perlocutionary effect might have a bearing on whether you think that every standard can be interpreted in this way. So maybe you have a different perlocutionary effect for a civil standard of proof. But again, if we stick to the criminal standard, then something like communication of disapproval of the criminal act will do. And again, I like Duff's theory, even if you don't like it, but if you don't like it, just plug in your favorite theory of punishment, and that's going to be the effect. Okay, so this is more on my turf, so to speak. So there's a massive, massive debate in epistemology on like what is the norm of assertion. It makes sense to ask this question also for verdicts. So Williamson resurrects some ideas that Searle had in 2000, and he thinks that there is a norm of assertion that makes it possible to engage in the practice of assertion. He thinks that that norm is knowledge, but the important thing here is that there is some kind of rule that we can extrapolate to theorize about what makes it possible to engage in a certain practice. But now we have an interesting link, right? So, okay, so if there is a norm of assertion, kind of norm of assertion will also project up to stronger assertions, to verdicts of guilt that have an assertive component. So you can move from this kind of constitutive norm of assertion to a constitutive norm of veredictives or assertive declarations or like a verdicts of guilt. And it would be something like this. So the fact finder must find the defendant guilty only if some property obtains. What are the candidates here? Well, they're the usual suspects, basically. So you might think that truth is the kind of norm to assert, and truth is also the kind of norm to find the defendant guilty. You might think that more is needed. You need knowledge to assert and to find the defendant guilty. You might think that even more is needed, that certainty is needed for both. I told you I'm not going to die on a hill for any of these norms, but I will express some sympathies, for sure. So let's start with a simple truth norm. And the idea will be something like this. You have to find the defendant guilty only if it is true that the defendant is guilty. Judy Thompson gives a beautiful case against this kind of norm. It's again in this paper that touches literally on everything you could possibly think when it comes to this kind of debate. So she says, okay, so suppose that all it takes to find someone guilty is to assert truly that they're guilty with the proper authority. Okay, think about this case. So suppose that the jury is puzzled by the evidence which has been presented to it. And they cannot arrive at a consensus as to its weight. I know, says one juror, let's decide by flipping a coin. Heads will impose liability, tails we don't. They agree, they flip up a coin, and it comes out heads. So they return and say the defendant is guilty. And then you have the criticism to this kind of norm. So they're so doing, it's not made acceptable by the fact, supposedly the fact, the defendant action is guilty. So the idea is that you might assert something that's true, you might do it also with the proper authority, but that's going to be too weak because truth by itself does not ensure the right type of connection that you need to have a sort of normatively appropriate verdict. Can you double up and go for knowledge? You can, and I think that this is a very good norm. So, and again, just to reconnect with what I was saying before, some of the legal epistemologists that defend a knowledge account, that's what they have in mind. They don't talk about assertion, but their intuitions, their motivations really suggest that what they have in mind is a norm that regulates these kind of verdicts of guilt. So find the defendant guilty only if you know that the defendant is guilty. And of course, this kind of norm can explain a lot of things. So we had this massive discussion in epistemology about whether you can assert that your ticket has lost the lottery just on the basis of the probabilities. Of course, just on the basis of the probabilities, you cannot know that your ticket is lost. So the knowledge number of assertion explains why you cannot just say that your ticket is lost on the basis of the probabilities. Now, this kind of norm will explain very similar proof paradoxical cases, because the proof paradox in the epistemology of evidence law debate is basically, or it's at least similar to a lottery case. So again, the prisoner's example, why does it feel so weird to assert that the prisoner is guilty when you know that 99 of the prisoners out of 100 attacked the guard? Well, that's because you don't know that they're guilty. So again, this kind of norm will explain very well why sometimes statistical evidence cannot ground, cannot undergird a verdict of guilt. So another thing that this norm explains very well is certain things that sound very, very weird when it comes to both ordinary parlance and trials. So Moore discovered this paradox, so he kind of realized that you cannot make an assertion and then disavow the assertion immediately afterwards. So if I say Girona is in Catalonia, but I don't know that Girona is in Catalonia, that's just going to sort of sound very weird. And what this says, according to many people, is that actually you need knowledge to assert. Because if you're certain and you deny knowledge, you basically block the norm of assertion. Something very similar is happening with trials, I think. So, and Sarah Moss, in her paper on knowledge and legal proof, has a little footnote in which she says something very similar to this. So she says, well, it would be so weird to say something like this. We find the defendant guilty, but we don't know that the defendant is guilty. Why does this sound so weird? Because to have a proper verdict of guilt, you need to have knowledge, and if you disavow it immediately afterwards, the speech act is effective. We might sort of pack our things and go home because maybe this is done, but actually, and this is the norm that I like the most, you can actually defend an even stronger requirement on both assertion and verdicts. So you might think that truth is not enough, knowledge is not enough, because what you need is certainty, which is a way more demanding level state. So the idea is that the fact finder must find the defendant guilty only if it is certain that the defendant is guilty. So certainty can be ascribed to states of affairs and also to people. So you can say that something is certain, you can say that you're certain of something, but usually epistemologists think that you should be psychologically certain of what is objectively certain. So don't think of this norm as a kind of, whimsical vibe that you have. So if you feel that something is certain, then you should assert it. No, you should track reality with a very sort of good basis of evidential support. But the interesting thing, and that's something that I really want to emphasize, is that certainty is way more demanding than knowledge. The languages that we speak, I think, help with this. So there is a difference in English between knowing and knowing for sure. There is a difference in Spanish, saber and saber con cierto. I think Catalan will also be similar, Italian is also similar. And this means that certainty makes a higher demand than knowledge. And the interesting thing is that whatever we said about the knowledge norm will also apply to a certainty norm that is more demanding. So for instance, this kind of certainty norm explains why you cannot make a lottery assertion. In fact, on the basis of purely statistical evidence, you cannot be certain that your ticket is lost. There's always the possibility that you won. And of course, you cannot be certain that the prisoner assaulted the guard, because there's always the possibility that the prisoner did not assault. And then you have also this kind of very weird assertions that can lend support to the idea that actually certainty is required to assert and to declare someone guilty. So people think that it's very weird to say something like this, dogs bark, but it is not certain that dogs bark. And more sort of relevant for our purposes, it's also very weird to say something like, we find the defendant guilty, but it is not certain that the defendant is guilty. I would be very worried if I was the defendant here. In fact, I would also be worried if I was a juror. So I would want to have something like certainty. Again, this is not a fight that I want to pick. It's not like a horse that I want to bet on, but surely there is some reason to think that it is a good norm. I haven't looked at this literature in a while, but I think at some point there was some very suggestive jury instruction on proof beyond reasonable doubt. So they mentioned the certainty, moral certainty. So I haven't found a lot of work on this, but I think that if you have some sympathy for the idea that proof beyond reasonable doubt is some kind of certainty that you need to have, I think this will be the norm for you. And I think it's a fascinating sort of road to explore. I'm not going to do it today, but I thought you should know that this is, I think, a strong contender. Okay, so what about these norms? I'm just going to give a little summary. Truth norm too weak, knowledge norm very good, certainty norm also good. I'm not going to take a stand on this, but if we should take a stand, we should look at both knowledge and certainty. Okay, so there's just one final thing that I would like to say, and that's a bit the kind of project that I'm thinking about at the moment. So how far can we go with this? So I focus on the criminal standard of proof. I think we made progress. So now we have an interesting picture. So we linked the criminal standard with a type of assertion. We also found some norm for this kind of assertion. And then we broke it down into these three sort of speech act theoretic components: the locutionary, the illocutionary, and the perlocutionary. The question that I think it's worth asking at this point is, how does this apply widely? And this is a question that I thought it would be worth asking because I'm going to sort of declare my ignorance, is that I just don't understand civil law enough to fill this table, basically. But maybe you do. But the important thing is that, in principle, there's no obstacle to do this. Here is a very sort of tentative and probably embarrassing attempt to do it. So I think, so I'm pretty confident of this bit. So you could think of the type of assertion as being increasingly less demanding. So at the beginning I said, well, you know, we have this datum of demandingness. Yes, that's good. I understand that, and I can use that to link it to less demanding norms. So for instance, the clear and compelling evidence, here we're talking about a full normal assertion. And maybe for the civil standard, you can just have a bit of a hedged assertion. So hedged means something like, yeah, the person broke the contract, I believe, or even better, the person broke the contract, probably. If it's a matter of probability, of balance of probabilities, I think that this kind of assertion is striking this kind of thing. What about the norm? I don't know which norm would it be, but you can at least go weaker and weaker. So it would be something like maybe just being in a position to know, and maybe here something like having some justification. And here things become a little bit more complicated for me at least. So what is the intended effect of imposition of liability? I guess it's going to depend. So maybe it has to do with I don't know, reconcile the two parties, award of remedies, damages. It must have to do with something like that. And maybe with like more serious cases, it will for sure like initiate legal action. It will change things, but you don't have the kind of seriousness that you find in the criminal standard, I think. But I don't know. So the point is not really how you're going to feel this. The point is whether you can. And if you can, then you have at least an interesting route to explore that maybe you could, in fact, think of the standards in terms of speech. Okay, so last slide. So you have on the board what I have done today. So I give you this interesting quote by Thompson. She links legal verdicts with something that we do with words. And then I try to sort of be a bit more fine-grained when it comes to standards. There's an aspect of belief, there's an aspect of assertion, communication. I was interested in the communicative question. And then I tried my hand with the standard that I think I understand a bit more, so the beyond reasonable doubt standard. Where did we land? Well, we have this kind of verdicts of guilt as these mixed, strengthened, multidimensional speech acts. They are subject to specific norms of assertion. Maybe it's not the norm that I gave you, but they are subject to norm of assertion. And you know, this talk has been limited. It didn't really give you a taxonomy, it didn't really give you a norm, but at the very least, I tried to attempt to show that you can pursue this kind of speech act theoretic approach, and if it wasn't fruitful in the way I did it, maybe it can be fruitful. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.